Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Noah. I'm the Programs Fellow at the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale Law School, which we call LEAP. LEAP is a new program that aims to inspire impactful learning and scholarship about the deep legal, scientific, and moral questions raised by humanity's treatment of animals. As part of that goal, we host a speaker series each year with the intention of breaking down disciplinary silos and paving the way for change. This year's theme is One Health, and we're exploring the interconnectedness of animal, human, and environmental health that creates our planetary immune system. I want to thank our organizational co-sponsors for making this event possible: the Yale Sustainable Food Program, the Yale Animal Law Society, the Yale Environmental Law Association, the Peabody Museum, the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies, and the Poynter Fellowship in Journalism. Today's event, which is called What About Bugs, will explore the health of global insect populations in the Anthropocene, why it's important, and the challenges of monitoring the health of this largest animal phylum. Estimates suggest there are roughly 7 million species of terrestrial arthropods in the world, but only 1 million have been named and studied. This vast swath of the animal kingdom contains unfamiliar species that are only found in jungles and tundras, and many that can be found in whatever room you're watching this talk from. This teeming sector of life underpins ecosystems all over the world. They decompose, pollinate, recycle nutrients, and form the base of food webs. As Brooke Jarvis brought to public attention in her 2018 New York Times Magazine article, reports have begun to surface that this massive life could be becoming much less massive. One exhaustive study in Germany reported a 70% decline in insect biomass over the past 3 decades, while an article in Science found a 45% decline in insect abundance among a majority of surveyed species. But frustratingly, high-quality data on insect populations are hard to come by, and snapshots of insect populations now can do little to reveal what they were in the past. It's a group of animals that are too small in size and too large in variety to study easily, and there's no reason to think that all populations of all insect species all over the world are changing in the same ways at the same time. But while insects are structurally difficult to study, they are far too important to ignore. 75% of our crop species are dependent on insect pollination, as are 80% of all flowering plants. Trouble on the scale of the insect can ripple through ecosystems and accelerate our current mass extinction. Some of our panelists have written engaging works that highlight the importance of insects around us. They've also worked on remarkable citizen science projects that tackle the problems of studying insects, public awareness, and science literacy at the same time. They have sifted through the noisy data on insect population changes to raise public consciousness about these issues, and we're grateful they've made the time to appear with us today. Before we move to the panelists' presentations, a few housekeeping notes. Each of our panelists will present a 6 or 7 minute uninterrupted presentation, and after all of them have spoken, we will move to audience Q&A. Throughout the event, please use the question and answer and chat features through Zoom to ask your questions. These options should be clickable at the bottom of your Zoom window. The panelists will begin answering questions when the individual presentations are finished. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the LEAP YouTube channel, so if you have to leave early, you'll be able to watch what you miss. Lastly, if you enjoyed this talk, we're hosting our final installment of our One Health speaker series next week at this time. The food and agriculture correspondent from Mother Jones Magazine, Tom Philpott, will be presenting a talk about his new book, Perilous Bounty, which explores the looming collapse of the American farm system and how we can prevent it. To register, you can check out our website, which is law.yale.edu/animals. I'll introduce each speaker before they present. Our first panelist is Brooke Jarvis, an award-winning journalist who wrote a cover story for the New York Times Magazine called The Insect Apocalypse is Here, in which she chronicled the emergence of concern about insect population declines. She's also written for the California Sunday Magazine, The New Yorker, Wired, GQ, and Harper's, documenting climate activism, the inhumanities inflicted on undocumented immigrants, and other issues of social and environmental justice. So there we go, Brooke.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Noah. Can you hear me all right? So Noah asked me to talk a little bit about the science communication part of writing about insects. And I thought of it a couple of weeks ago. I was reading the homepage of the New York Times Magazine. No, sorry, the homepage of the New York Times. And they have a little place where they call out the most popular stories. And I had to laugh a little when I looked at this list of stories, which went, Authentic wins the Kentucky Derby, run without fans. Watch these 15 movies before they leave Netflix this month. And wildflowers blot out sun in the Bay Area. And to me, that was really indicative of kind of the challenge that you face as a science journalist. that so many of these stories that should be huge deals, they should be the kinds of things that, you know, we have big reactions to, they become these one-day stories, and you read them and you think, oh yeah, that sounds bad. And then you sort of move on with your day. And I'd seen this happen, you know, so many times with so many different headlines. You know, I noticed one last week. I don't know who saw the headline, "Fifth of countries at risk from ecosystem collapse, analysis finds." But of course, that was on a day when the big story of the day was Trump returns to the campaign trail. So I definitely see my goal is trying to make some of these stories more than these one day or 15-minute reading interval events, and get people to really spend some time with what they mean. So a few years ago, I saw the study that Noah mentioned out of Krefeld, Germany, that found a dramatic up to 82% decline in the population of flying insects within the German nature reserves that they study. And it actually got a lot of attention for a study of this kind, which is to say much more than many, but much less than, you know, whatever was happening on that season of The Bachelor. I don't know when The Bachelor is on TV. And, you know, I had that reaction again of, we should be paying more attention to this. And something that I try to do as a journalist is bring multiple levels to the stories that I write about. So I usually think of them as having, you know, in this case, like something that was obviously important to cover is what actually is happening to insects, and why does it matter? You know, why should we care that insects seem to be disappearing? Especially because the study came on the heels of many years of concern about insect decline that was hard to quantify and hard to talk about, because a lot of it was more felt than measured. As Noah discussed, it's a pretty tricky topic, and I think we'll hear more about that from David later. But the second part, you know, I really wanted to dig into that, the question of why these changes are so hard for not just we regular people, but scientists to see. You know, there's a term for that, which is shifting baseline syndrome, that we all tend to take whatever we're used to as the norm, and we don't think about the fact that the world maybe used to be different, as in many cases it was. There's the famous example of people not realizing that the fish that they caught in the Florida Keys were getting smaller and smaller over each generation, and they would stand there with the fish and their smile would be just as big as the smiles of people 60 years ago. And so capturing the scientific challenge of that is really interesting to me, because it's sort of, you know, a way to see science as detective work, to look beyond the temporal parochialism of living in our present and trying to see the world as it once was and as it could be in the future, and then finding, in the case of insects, sometimes some really creative and unusual clues to let us know, you know, things. I've talked to people who have studied herbarium samples to try to see whether the leaves preserved 150 years ago were chewed more often by insects than the leaves that people preserve now. Or in science, of course, you have people looking at the earwax of whales, looking at ice cores, and these are all ways of just trying to situate our present moment within a broader way of thinking. So that's how I began to look at this story, as sort of two stories. Why do insects matter, but also why do we know so little about what's happening around us in the world? You know, we live in the world, and yet we are really freaked out to realize that these changes have been happening, and in many cases, we haven't recognized them. And I think that was a big part of why the article was successful and got a lot of attention. If you read the comments, the people who read it, so much of it is people just telling the stories of their childhoods and the bugs that they used to experience and the things that they used to see and how it's different from what they experience now, and feeling this really emotional whiplash because of it. You know, feeling like, how could I not have noticed this? How could I be blind to these changes that affect me, and that now that I think about them are so extreme? And how did I never see it? So that's really influenced my thinking even since this article. When I write about the environment and about conservation science, is that question of really trying to see the world around us clearly before it's too late. And I just see that I have, yeah, I've hit the end of my time. But that's where, yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Brooke. Our next panelist is David Wagner, a professor of entomology at the University of Connecticut, who studies butterflies and moths and who has combed through the available data on insect population trends for publications like the Annual Review of Entomology. Yes, so David, you can begin sharing your presentation. It looks like you're still muted. You can click unmute and then you can work through the.
You see that?
There we go. Yeah.
Okay, so
thank you.
So the big picture on the global insect decline is that we're getting lots of reports, maybe 2 or 3 dozen pretty alarming reports about insect declines, but we are also starting to see our first reports that insects may not be declining. 2 larger studies have found that across long-term study sites in North America, there appears to be very little insect decline, and we're even hearing reports of aquatic insects increasing. But most of the reports are conveying pretty serious losses, and it relates to what Brooke spoke about in terms of this shifting baseline. And I'll get back to that. It's very, very important phenomenon that helps us understand what we're seeing. But in terms of first principles, we know that insects are declining. We know that mammals across the globe and birds across the globe are declining. We know that rainforests are being cut. We have the entire Midwest converted into soybean and corn and that sort of thing. So it's very important to just sort of keep in mind common sense and know that we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. We're in the shoot of the Anthropocene with climate change now on top of deforestation and all of the other anthropomorphic stressors or anthropogenic stressors that we have. So what I'd like to do before we really get started though is, let's see if I can advance the slides. I want to talk a little bit about some of the spatial trends and the temporal trends that we're seeing, but it's affecting all taxa near as we can tell. It's ground dwelling organisms, it's the parasites, it's the caterpillars. And again, as Noah said, it's from the high Arctic to the neotropics and includes, and this is really important, formerly abundant species. So, you know, as conservation biologists or people that worry about biodiversity or Mother Nature, try and take care of her, it seems like we're always focused on rare species and the endangered and imperiled species and these things that need the conservation agencies and laws to protect them. But this isn't about that at all. And so this is actually about the abundant species. These things that are super common, that we take for granted in our backyard, they're the ones that provide all the ecological services. You have to be abundant and common to make soil, to do the pollination services, to do the biological control of other bugs. And so we're really talking about a crisis of a very different nature in the sense that we're talking about the loss of common species. So, and so we're, you know, these are the things that we really worry about with this phenomenon, the insect apocalypse or insect decline. What's really important here is sort of the details, and so that we're getting conflicting reports from different scientists from different areas of the globe over different time periods. So what we really want to talk about here is some of the details about the who, what, when, where, and why. And this is maybe the first global study that came out. It was a study by Durzo, and it really, let's see. this figure of most of the invertebrates are looked at, we've got this 45% mean decline. And this is over about 40 years. And so this is actually one of the major take-home messages, in that we're only seeing 1% decline per year across many studies. And 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but 1% per year is actually catastrophic. That's 10% of your biomass, or 10% of your individuals in a given period of time. This is a recent study out of Ohio, and it's looking at the butterflies, again, over a period of this time about 20 years. And it was up to a 2% decline. 2% decline or 1% decline, you can't see. You can't go out even over 2 or 3 years and see that. So you don't really realize what's happening. It's something that happens over a decade or 2 decades. And almost anybody who's maybe say 40 years or older are the people that are saying, hey, we don't see as many bugs on our windshield. We don't see as many moths around lights. You know, I could never leave my screen door open before, but now I can leave my screen door open if I want, or my door open, and there won't be that many bugs in the house. And so this is really, it's a hard problem, and that insects have these boom and bust life cycles. And so they have this tremendous fluctuation, 10-fold, 100-fold between generations, yet you're trying to measure or see only a 1% or 2% decline over years. It's a very, very hard problem. Let's look a little bit at the timeline. And this, I think we want to look at the details about the who, what, where, when, and why, because we want to solve this mystery. It's forensic entomology. It's a problem. And by looking at the details, maybe we can get some insight as to what the stressors are, or what the problem is, or where we need to spend our money, or where we need to pass laws to protect these insects that are providing so many ecosystem functions and ecosystem services for us. This is the decline. The x-axis here goes over essentially from 1750 to 2050, a very long time span. And the important thing here is that this decline has been happening a very long time. And so the green line here is the average. And then something that I find really interesting is the red dots are basically data for butterflies prior to World War II, and the blue dots are butterfly decline after World War II. And what happened after World War II is agriculture became industrialized. And so this is when we get our pesticides, this is when we get our tractors, and this is when we start shutting down small family farms that are nature friendly, or at least more nature friendly than sort of the industrialized or commercial grade farms that we now have. So another thing, again, looking at the details really matters here. And this is the best data set that we have in the world for insects. This is moths in Great Britain, and over 24 million records. And things were okay until about 1980, and things are sliding down again at that rate that we've mentioned before. And this is about the time that climate change really started to have effects. This slide shows the 1 to 2% decline of moths in Great Britain. This is a very well-known study, but the important thing here is that the upper graph, moths are actually increasing and getting more common in the northern part where it's warming up due to climate change, but the southern part has a very steep, even faster decline than the 1 to 2%. So if you just look at overall trends, you might not see things all so important or that different, but actually the details matter here, in that the northern places or the higher latitudes are actually increasing due to climate change. This is my own data that's about to come out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. This is 3 different sites where we're looking at caterpillar abundance. I think the top plot is Arizona, in the middle is Costa Rica, and the bottom is Ecuador. Very different patterns. We do not see declines everywhere. We see sharp declines. You see a decline here in Costa Rica. It's very noisy in Arizona. We're not necessarily seeing a decline, and we're also seeing this same sort of deal in Ecuador. It's not obvious. And note that for the most part, these are uninhabited areas. So I'm getting to the end here. Let me back up one. Let's see if I can do that. it's very important to keep in mind that most of these dire reports that you're reading are coming from Europe, particularly Western Europe and Northern Europe. You have about 300 people living per square kilometer there. We don't know what's happening in wildlands, what's happening in Canada, what's happening in the neotropics. 85% of the insects could be in the tropical regions of the world. We do have reports in the United States, but again, they're heavily impacted places. They're the Central Valley of California, where we have lots of people and agriculture, and in the Midwest with lots of agriculture. This is a very important point in terms of trying to figure out what this is about or what the mystery is. This is the most frightening thing I have to share with you. This is Costa Rica. This is Santa Rosa National Park. This is black lighting, or you're putting lights out to attract moths in 2007. This is the same location in 2019. This is catastrophic collapse. This is when you're talking about birds going downhill and lizards and ecosystem functions going downhill. And so quite alarmed about the reports that are now coming out of Costa Rica. There's now 3 independent reports coming out of Costa Rica that suggest that insects are in collapse there. So in terms of looking into the future, I'm afraid that the thing that I see that really could be a deal changer is the drying out of tropical forests due to climate warming and droughts, especially having a big impact. And this is Dan Jansen, who's collected a lot of this data and is starting to write about this. And despite what the slide says, he's really thinking now that this decline has to be driven by climate change, particularly a drying of the tropical forests. So I think that's all I'm going to share in terms of slides, and some of the details that become important in terms of our thinking about what's really driving and where we need to be paying attention.
Thank you, David, for that excellent presentation. Our next panelist is Deanna Beasley, a professor of ecology and entomology at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, whose lab uses insect species to model adaptations to urban environments. She's also organized and written about citizen science contributions to the field of ecology. There we go.
Okay, thank you for having me. I will let me quickly share my screen with you. I cancel that. Okay, so I'd like to start off with just kind of sharing my origin story, so to speak, in terms of how I became a scientist, because I'm quite committed to engaging with students and getting them interested in the science, but also getting them interested in the biodiversity that is around them. So I teach at University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Chattanooga is a kind of mid-sized city, about 2 hours away from Atlanta, Georgia. And so for a lot of students who come to UTC, they're from the region. They haven't really seen much beyond just the Southeast region of the United States. And so, so for me, you know, I came into insect ecology not because I had a burning love for insects, but mainly because I was interested in questions related to how do organisms respond to environmental change. I think like most undergrad students who go into biology, there's probably this interest in medicine or going into medicine, which was the case for me. But then I took an ecology course and immediately fell in love and decided that this was the direction I wanted to take. So I really didn't start studying insects until I started grad school. And so here's an image of me with Madagascar hissing cockroaches. These were organisms that were in our lab, and my advisor, Tim Mousseau, challenged me to do a study to understand the how they're responding to environmental change. We were interested in studying the environmental effects of the Chernobyl disaster, which we'll get into in just a moment. And I apologize, my office lights go off automatically. But I came to appreciate insects because they do, they're so closely tied to environmental change. And so in a sense can serve as a bioindicator of change, of the quality of a given environment. Insects are found across many terrestrial ecosystems and even human modified environments, which I'll get into in a moment. And their development, their physiology, their behavior is also sensitive to environmental change. And so for a number of organisms such as the periodical cicada, which is very charismatic and is only found in this part of the world, in the in the eastern part of the North America, when they emerge, the volume of their calls are all tied to environmental effects. And so it can provide us some insight in terms of how they're doing within the given environment. But as I said, my interest in understanding these questions were related back to studying the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. This was an event where large quantities of cesium was spread throughout the environment. And it had this, based on the weather conditions at the time, created this very variable effect in terms of the amount of radiation in a given area. And when this was in the beginning, they sent in a number of workers to kind of actively clean it up, and they started to see increases in cancers in young children of these cleaners and so forth. And so questions came up in terms of the impact of the environmental quality on the human populations that were still there. My research, I was interested in understanding these impacts on insect populations. And so I studied grasshoppers, looking at the transgenerational effects. So parents who were in these environments, were the impacts on their offspring, even if you remove the offspring from that environment. And we see effects of smaller size in the offspring and from parents who were reared in really high radiation effects. So here's my study environment today. So I shifted from thinking in terms of these large scale events to thinking more to what's becoming a common feature in our terrestrial landscape. We're becoming increasingly more urban. So this is Chattanooga, Tennessee. For folks who have not had a chance to visit Chattanooga, it's beautiful. It has this reputation of being a great space for folks who are interested in the outdoors, and for folks who want to kind of integrate themselves with nature, whether that's through hiking or rock climbing and the like. But this wasn't always the case for Chattanooga. Back in 1970s, it was called the dirtiest city in America. Chattanooga had a very significant industrial and factory presence, and to the point where folks would bring in extra work shirts because just walking outside would turn their white shirts gray. That was how much pollution was in the air. And so credit to city leaders for cleaning up and changing the image of the city, but there's still discrepancies in terms of who's still taking the brunt of this environmental degradation. We still have cases in Chattanooga that is still heavily polluted and damaged. And so this is one of those places. Southside Chattanooga was actually designated a Superfund site. And this is a place that's located in minority communities and neighborhoods and the like. So my interest is, understanding how this variation in terms of the quality within our cities can have an impact, not only in insect populations, but it certainly has implications for human populations. And so our understanding of urban environments from an ecological standpoint is still relatively new. Urban environments have more fragmented landscapes, more paved surfaces, high human population densities, food waste, pollution, as I mentioned before. We tend to see more instances of invasive species, where they're just introduced unintentionally by humans or intentionally if we find a particular species attractive or appealing in our urban space. But also probably one of the key features of urban environments is that they're hotter. Here is just a map just kind of comparing the variation in urban heat across the city. You have spaces that, if we're looking at this heat map at the bottom, just kind of shows that there are certain parts of the city that are hotter than others. So there's even variation in what we call the urban heat island effect. And studies recently are starting to come out that we start to see a relationship between parts of the neighborhood or parts of the city that have historically been redlined, meaning that they were intentionally deprived or just not invested in by local governments and even at the federal level, and the degree of temperature that these spaces experience. And so what we tend to find is that neighborhoods that historically have been redlined experience sometimes upwards of 12.6 degrees difference in temperature. And Chattanooga is one of the worst offenders, being sometimes as high as a 10-degree difference between these formerly redlined neighborhoods and other parts of the city. And so my goal with my research is to explore these questions, explore these effects of this variation in insect populations, but also involve students in this type of research, because my goal is to hopefully inspire them to pursue these questions and to be engaged with this in the space that they live in. So we have looked at how, for example, ants have responded to various food availability as a function of arthropod diversity. Still trying to make sense of what that data is telling us, but we do tend to find a shift towards a preference towards fats in the diet as in the more warmer parts of the city. We also have done studies looking at cicadas, and here I think this is where Noah would like me to speak more to the citizen science aspect of it. Periodical cicadas are widely dispersed, and as a result, for me as a scientist, I can't be at multiple places at once. And so this was a unique opportunity to engage with the general public, ask them, are you seeing cicadas? Are you hearing cicadas? And will you send us cicadas to look at how they're doing in terms of body size. Body size can tell us something about reproductive potential in our females, and males are the ones doing most of the singing. So larger males can produce a larger sound. And we got a tremendous response from citizen scientists. We received cicadas spanning from North Carolina all the way up into New York. And we were able to compare body size across cicadas found in cities versus cicadas found outside the cities, excuse me. And we were able to show that in the northern part of the cicadas range, in cities, they appeared to be getting smaller they were getting larger in size. And so it raises interesting questions in terms of how just as the environment becomes increasingly more city-like, how insects can potentially respond to that. I'll leave with this last point where we're currently working, doing similar work, interested in honeybees. Chattanooga has a very active amateur beekeeper group, and we're very interested in understanding how honeybees are responding to urban changes. Depending upon where you place your hive, for example, how are these bees doing? And so my undergrad honor student, Evan Bailey, is helping with that study, and we're also working with amateur beekeepers, and they're very enthusiastic in that sense in terms of sharing their work. So I'll end with just kind of a take home here, and that the key takeaways: urban environments have unique ecological characteristics that have implications not only for insect populations, but also human populations. And especially when we ask questions about marginalized groups or underserved groups, what that means in terms of the overall health of our cities. Insects can respond to urban environments in a variety of ways, and that's going to have implications for the biodiversity that we see in cities. And engaging with students and also with citizen science will not only help prepare future researchers to tackle these questions, but it also allows us to identify these large ecological patterns. And then just overall, just a question of cities are going to become a common fixture in our environment. So the question should be, how do we design healthy cities? How do we design biodiverse cities? So, thank you.
Thank you, Deanna. I appreciate that excellent presentation. So our last speaker before the Q&A is Rob Dunn. He is an ecologist at North Carolina State University and the author of Never Home Alone, The Natural History of Where We Live. His writing and research tackles the complexity of the species all around us in our homes and workplaces, and it shows how our in-house ecosystems work. Thank you.
Thanks, Noah. Thanks, everybody. This has really been amazing. Deanna, I hadn't seen some of that work. Fantastic. So I'm going to talk about something slightly different. I was really inspired by the idea of empathy, and I wanted to think about insects and empathy a little bit. And to me, empathy has to have the companion of care. And so how do we think about the empathy that we have toward insects and the care that we take in relating to them and caring for their environments? And where does that sit in society? And I think for the most part, we often have a tendency with regard to empathy and care to be very sort of simple-minded and focus on shiny things, that we have all these cognitive biases, that we tend to like and empathize with things that look like us or in some way resonate with us, you know? So big cats and pandas and puppies, very easy to empathize with. But the truth is, if we're thinking about nature, most of nature is not like us. We're actually super weird as vertebrates. Vertebrates are unusual, fancy, shiny things on nature's smallness, which is a reflection of the fact that most species are small species. And so what this image shows is different organisms as a reflection of their diversity. And this is their known diversity. And so most multicellular species are insects and other arthropods. And then you get some plants over here. You get a token bird over there to reflect that birds are kind of diverse. And here, if you can see my cursor, is a mammal. And so as mammals, we're strange. And so if we only empathize with species that are like us, we're in trouble because we're not actually empathizing with nature. I think the good news is that there's a long history of humans actually empathizing with more of nature. And so these are poems by a Japanese poet, Kobayashi Issa, who I really like, from the 1400s. And Issa writes, for example, "The winter fly I caught and finally freed, the cat quickly ate." Or, "For you too, my fleas, the night passes slowly, but you won't be lonely." Or, "Now we are leaving, the houseflies can make love to their heart's desire." And so on. And so in these poems, Issa is empathizing with these species that he simultaneously recognizes can be pests to him at the same time. Or, "One human being, one fly in a large room," or "The bed bugs scatter as I clean parents and children." And so this is empathy at its richest. Or one of my favorites here, "Don't worry, spiders, I keep house casually." And so I think we can strive for this kind of empathy. But at the same time, I think the barriers to empathizing with insects around us and other arthropods have actually increased, and so too the barriers to caring. And I think this has happened for a bunch of reasons. One of the reasons is that most of us now live in cities, and in the future, nearly all of us, by most estimates, will live in cities. And so a lot of the nature that we would have historically noticed is far away. The other shift is that for a variety of reasons, we've come to regard many of the species that we see in cities as just bad, not complicated. In Issa's poems, the indoor species bedbugs, they were complex, they were complicated. They weren't bad. But we have a tendency to think of the species in our houses and our cities, the pigeons, the cockroaches, and the like, as just not good things. But the trick is, those are the species we see most often. And so if we don't empathize with them and care for them, how are we going to care for the rest of nature that we are far less likely to see? And I think it's a real challenge. Meanwhile, the other challenge is that much of life is actually in some way beyond empathy. And I mean this in a couple of ways. One is that life is so diverse that most species we're never going to see and we're never going to know about them. And so how do you empathize with something that you can't relate to in any way, even just cognitively? And so to put this in just sort of stark terms, most species are not yet named. That's true even for animals. Virtually no species are well studied. To a first approximation, there are no well-studied species on Earth. And most individual people know a tiny minority of the species that are well studied. And so we see this when we realize that we don't have good data about what's happening with insects. Well, individually we know so little, but collectively we also know so little. And so how is empathy going to work to help us care for these things that we can't really make tangible? And how do we do this recognizing that life is going to, the life that that's easier for us to appreciate is going to get farther and farther away? And I think another approach is, rather than having empathy for all of this unknown, is to think about something else, which is to say, to think about wonder. And here's another quote, this one from David Sedaris, and this one is from a moment when David Sedaris was in France and he notices a spider, and he has this reaction to the spider, and this is from a piece in the New Yorker. He writes, I was at my desk one afternoon writing a letter when I heard a faint buzzing sound like a tiny car switching into higher gear. Curious, I went to the window, and there in a web I saw what looked like an angry raisin. It was a trapped fly, and as I bent forward to get a closer look, a spider rushed forth and carried it screaming to a little woven encampment situated between the wall and the window casing. It was like watching someone you hate get mugged. 3 seconds of hardcore violence, and when it was over, you just wanted it to happen again. And then he goes on, at that moment, I stood at the window with my mouth hanging open. All I recognized was a profound sense of wonder. And so in this, I think Sedaris is relating to this experience in some ways not totally unlike Issa's relationship to the species around here, but with this added sense of wonder. And I think wonder is something we need to add to empathy as we think about the insects around us and other arthropods. And so rather than just thinking about the empathy for those species, we need instead an appreciation for the wonder of their complexity, the wonder of the size of what's not yet known, an appreciation for the reality that nature is not like us, but instead much more interesting, much more complex, and still into the far future not fully knowable. And so I think we need this concept when we're thinking about insects and conservation in the future, because I think that empathy here is very difficult. And I do a lot of work, and I'll close here, on microbes. And with microbes, this is even truer. One recent estimate suggested there might be 1 trillion species of microbes. If that's true, we basically haven't started to study them at all. And yet, how am I going to inspire empathy for those microbes? I don't think I can, but maybe I can inspire wonder, awe, and a sense of the ways in which the biological world is every bit is grand and sort of life-stopping as is the universe itself. And then I'm going to close by responding to one of the questions that came up when Deanna was talking, which was how we as scientists can have a more productive and healthy relationship with the public. And I think one of the answers is that we can relate to the public in the context of science and nature by thinking about empathy and awe. Empathy for the public. What does the public want to know? How does the public think about nature? How do different publics think about nature? We're not very good at listening to those questions. And I think about in Deanna's talk, the two guys who were sitting in the heat sweating because they were in a part of the city that has a huge urban heat island effect. What do they want to know about the science of their city? But I also think that awe component is important, because as scientists, we get to experience awe all the time. It's an occupational hazard. We walk down the hall and somebody tells us, "You'll never guess what I just discovered." And it's one of the best parts of the job, but we're terrible at sharing that awe. And so I think that's another key component. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rob. That was fantastic. So I'll bring everyone back. And yeah, so before we start answering audience questions, I'm curious whether any of y'all have questions for each other that came up while you were watching your presentations. And if not, we can start on a question about, I think it's, yes, Rob?
Well, I was going to ask Brooke about the New York Times, the insect apocalypse piece, and how did that change your writing career, what you could write about, what you wanted to write about? Did it make you feel done with insects forever? What followed?
No, it didn't make me feel done with insects. In fact, I'm working on sort of taking that piece in another direction, which has been slowed by the pandemic. But yeah, it really opened my eyes a little bit to how much you can connect with people over so environmental stories are traditionally seen as the hardest to tell. I can tell you that they're the hardest to convince editors to do most of the time. One reason is because people see them as predictable and they see them as depressing. They've got, the same kind of characters, they've got the same kind of outcomes, and we all just, feel like we need to give up. And so I think it really showed the value of doing it in a more surprising way, a way that, as I said before, a lot of people really, I think they empathized with, they felt it in their own experience and really wanted to talk about that own experience. I always think there was a person who responded who said, I'm 20 and I see all of the people in the comments talking about these experiences you used to have with the abundance of insects. And I've never experienced that. But when I read you writing about it, it feels like I have, it feels like that's part of my own past, even though it's not. She connected with it in this emotional way. And yeah, I think like if you give people the chance to feel that way, I don't know, I guess I'm just sort of chasing, trying to make similar things happen. Yeah.
Thanks, Brooke.
Thank you, Brooke. And then we had a question about, I think mostly directed at David, but anyone can jump in, about the role of pesticide use in possible insect population declines. And if I've understood some of the literature best, like a lot of the declines in insect populations have been happening in reserve areas, right? Which means that pesticides might not be a large portion of the phenomena.
It's really one of the big questions. And you can hear me? Yeah, so yes. It's one of the big questions. We don't know. There's a lot of people that are blaming pesticides initially. So some scientists are, some scientists aren't. The really frightening thing about the Costa Rican situation I showed you is there are no pesticides really in these rainforests. And so that's really going to be a different problem. In the high Arctic and mountains, we don't have pesticide problems yet. We're still seeing insect decline. I'm afraid the bad news is it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's pesticides, it's agricultural intensification, it's deforestation. And really right now, I think all our eyes in terms of protecting Mother Nature needs to be focused on climate change. And so we often hear about climate change and think about climate change in terms of global warming. But I would just love if everyone could keep in mind that it's really much worse than just global warming, in the sense that we actually think that just climate variability, the freeze and thaw cycles that we now see really can mess up a lot of animals, and probably droughts may be the number one thing. So we think about climate change and you hear about people talking about global warming, but maybe the most devastating thing of all for insects, they're all surface area, no volume whatsoever, is a drought. And I think that we're going to have longer droughts. We're going to have droughts of greater duration, and they're going to be higher, a higher intensity. But what's really bad is when they're combined with these warmer temperatures. And so that is going to change nature, and it's going to change agriculture. And that's what I find most frightening. But it's even all these knock-on effects. It's the removal of the blanket of snow that we used to see. It's the fires in California and Australia. There's just all kinds of knock-on effects in Costa Rica. Just to show you the complexity of the problem, you used to have these cloud forests. Monteverde was very famous, a place we all wanted to go. We all wanted to go to a cloud forest to see these wonderful birds. The clouds are getting pushed up, and as that happens, army ants are coming up these mountains and devastating these creatures that have never been exposed to army ants ever. So we're seeing the biological evolution of all these ecosystems starting to unravel and be torn apart, and we don't really know what the stressors are. But to bring it back to pesticides, we are looking at neonicotinoids, and we are seeing pesticides in our waters. But your point that there's not decline with there's not decline in areas. I should say there is decline in areas away from these pesticides. So that's a very important clue in this insect decline problem. But neonicotinoids, these new pesticides, are getting quite a bit of attention, particularly in agricultural areas. And the mosquito spraying that somebody brought up in the chat clearly has a role in cities and in suburbs in particular. And overuse of pesticides in lawns is probably also an important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, David. And Rob, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think there were a number of questions about, well, what can I do? Or like this is all dark and doomy. Is there any shiny stuff? And I think one thing to take home is that if we're going to do bold new things, the time is beginning to be now, right? That the time is now. And I think there are a lot of people thinking really creatively about how to imagine different futures, different relationships to nature, different ways of designing cities. I just had a meeting with architects who were imagining cities where all the buildings run on the friction and heat from the sewage going underneath the buildings, and where the buildings themselves are zero emissions and actually are absorbing toxins from the outside. And I went to meetings like that 10 years ago, and they were super exciting. But what was different about this meeting is that these were being built. And so I think there are people really aggressively moving forward with new kinds of relationships to nature, and that we need to do that now. We need to do bold things now. And I think that there's a much more support for being bold right now than there was 10 years ago. And so, is the challenge great? Yes. But I think there are way more people ready to do something really new, which is what it's going to take. And the other thing I would say is that I often get caught up in my meetings thinking, well, okay, I'll do this tomorrow, I'll do this. But to recognize that much of what we build today is the infrastructure for 50 years from now. And so when we build buildings, we build roads, we build all these parts of our world. And so, I mean, to actively engage these conversations in what we're making, because 2070 is actually not far away. The roads for 2070 are being laid today. The buildings for 2070 are being built today. And so I think that there is hopefulness in engaging those hands-on ways of changing the world around you. And the other thing I'll say is that what's threatened is not nature, right? Nature will go on. Nature doesn't care about us very much. The microbial side of my workday knows that there are species that, as hot and terrible as we make the world, they will love it. They will thrive. And so what's at risk is nature that sustains us, nature that we find beautiful and wonderful and rich. And so I think that's also different. We need to bear in mind that this is also an act of self-preservation, of preserving a world that we find beautiful and sustaining, which is different than just imagining the entire world is collapsing.
Thank you, Rob.
Say a few things. There's a new article coming out on things that individuals can do. That'll be out in the Proceedings of the National Academy, I think in December this year. And it's 8 things that individuals can do to benefit insects and preserve the ecosystem services. And I think that's an important piece. Certain ways of just keeping your yard can bring quite a bit of insects and nectar onto the scene. Cutting back cosmetic use of pesticides. There's a lot that individuals can do. Voting is very important in terms of environmental policy. As we know, how we eat, how we grow our food, that becomes important. And just to relate to what Rob was saying a little bit, I mean, this decline is being driven by humans. There's no question about it. Fossil fuel use and the way we do agriculture and deforestation and that sort of thing. These things took millions of years to evolve, and there are some pretty tight relationships, and the really specialized and complex organisms and the big organisms are going to disappear. And I think we have a moral and ethical right to it's not our manifest destiny to overrun the planet for human consumption and human need. And I think there's urgent ethical and moral reasons to do a better job of protecting some of these things that are fragile and took millions of years. Listen, nature is red and claw, and every organism had to fight for millions of years to be here and be on the stage with us. And I think we need to move from being a user to a steward and take better care of our planet and give our children a better place, a better theater.
Thank you, David. Deanna, I had a question for you about whether or not your lab and the research into urban environments has attracted any interest from urban planners and other people who do urban policy, the same way that now you start seeing bird-friendly building codes being implemented in some localities?
Not directly, and it may, and it's not to say that the interest isn't there. Certainly, especially in Chattanooga, which does have a, rather, outdoor friendly community in that sense. There's, I usually get invites from more like amateur naturalist groups to kind of speak to the city or urban ecology. But I wanted to, kind of speak to some of the questions that I see, popping up in the chat. One of the challenges, especially when it comes to urban ecology and engaging with the general public with citizen science, is that there is a significant amount of privilege involved. Usually we find that folks who are interested in citizen science are already engaged in some way or form. So the question of how do you reach groups who may not have access or who may have been historically underserved, presents a challenge. And one of the things that, I've been thinking about with my research and group is, actually just going to folks who are interested in urban design, interested in roads, interested in greenway design, and asking them, as following up on Rob's point, what are you interested in? We have questions as academics that we find interesting. I'm interested in the ecology of insects along greenways, for example, but they may be more interested in, how do we encourage more folks to use the greenway, or how do we influence who has access to the greenways? So I think the first step, in terms of engaging different groups is to actually meet with them and actually determine what are they interested in, what are their questions. So it's, I have all in terms of like what you can do, I would say, I think honestly, it's the voting and getting involved at the local level. In order to pave the way for, the future and the like, you have to send leadership that will advocate for facilitating those changes, right? And then also diversifying our science, like who is doing the science is going to make a difference in terms of the types of questions we ask and the solutions that we find, right? Currently, right now, a lot of ecology is overwhelmingly white men doing the research, and there's a wealth of knowledge and information in indigenous and people of color who we haven't fully tapped into due to the fact that historically they've been excluded. So, so there is opportunity there. I think as we think about insect decline and these impacts, we also have to think about how we are doing the science and who is doing the science as well. And then that's going to have some implications in terms of creating and finding these solutions.
Thank you. We are coming up on the end of the scheduled talk. So thank you guys so much for
Thank you.
being here today and engaging with our audience.